there's some sign that there will be a new nuclear capacity in Europe, but it will take some time apparently. So, two countries neighboring Germany, namely Poland and the Czech Republic, plan on creating some nuclear capacity in the 2030s, probably. So, as we featured in a previous Power Hour, Germany plans to phase out all of its remaining nuclear capacity by the end of 2022, and then all of its coal capacity somewhere in the late 2030s. And Poland in May announced that they will have their first nuclear reactor probably operational by 2033. And overall, they plan on maybe six reactors in the online in the 2040s with about 6 to 9 gigawatts of generation capacity. And right now, Poland relies heavily on coal for its electricity generation. And I think this is not coincidental with the German plans because Germany might want to pay some premium on reliable energy then in the 2030 to 2040 realm. And the Czech Republic already has some nuclear capacity right now, but they plan on replacing some aging reactors around 2035 and then also add some capacity later on. Um, and one of the goals, at least in the case of the Czech Republic, is to decrease CO2 emissions overall by increasing the nuclear share of generation capacity and also a reliable energy grid. I think they fear somewhat that the German energy transition experiment will actually harm their grid because all of the Central European grids are sort of connected and integrated. So we get, sometimes we import or export from France and Switzerland and so on. So there's something going on there that makes neighboring countries uneasy about Germany's trajectory here. And one of the things that you can immediately see here is the current state of European nuclear power, which is similar to the American state of nuclear power, which is high initial cost, which is why governments get involved in that with loan guarantees and subsidies, and then long lead times to actually construct the reactors. And this is something where you would think, yeah, this needs to be fixed. If nuclear power is really part of, a replacement strategy for fossil fuels in the mid to long term, at a minimum, we need to make it easier to create nuclear capacity. Even if we continue to use the same nuclear technology, the light water reactors that we are currently using, then we need to speed up construction similar to what we did in the 1960s and 70s. And so there must be improvement to the regulatory framework. So these two countries will do like a marginal increase of nuclear capacity. I don't think it will actually be on that then again in the totality of Europe, considering that Germany and probably even France will plan on reducing their capacity. So this is sort of the sorry state of nuclear technology right now. One, because of the government involvement, and two, because the technology hasn't advanced. Also because of the government involvement, in my view, but that's a topic for a different power hour.
So this point about the European grid being integrated, I think is something that should probably be stressed more because I think often when people often hear about a grid in a different country and then they'll just think about ours and then they'll just think, oh well, Germany does this, or certainly some place like Denmark, a tiny place, and they'll think, oh well, then we could just do that here. But I mean, does it even make any sense to think in terms of the grid of Denmark? I mean, is that like thinking about the grid of Rhode Island, in the sense that all these things? So how do you think about the European grid, and then what do we know about the actual percentages of different things on that grid?
Well, so there's, in a sense, each country, like each grid region in North America, has sort of its own domestic fleet and infrastructure. But there are many interconnectors between the different grid regions. For example, inside Germany, there are different grid regions, but then also to the neighboring countries. And so there's a lot of import and export going on within the core region of the European Union and the European continent. And yeah, So in the case of Denmark, for example, it makes no sense to look at Denmark in isolation, because Denmark on its own would probably not be able to run its own power grid. It has massive, like 20, 30 plus percent of imports and exports every year of electric power. And it heavily relies on wind in domestic generation, but it would totally not be able to keep its grid stable without outside help of storage and supply of reliable energy. And yeah, so it's difficult to assess these, because the outside trade is often handled differently in these sort of statistical assessments of power generation. And often we hear, oh yeah, Germany added this and that much capacity, but you have to look at this in the larger context, of course. Like, what are the surrounding grid areas having it as pools of generation capacity and so on. So it doesn't really make sense to look at it in isolation, but the national statistic work like this. So much of the information that is presented in news articles and so on is focused on like national borders, which doesn't make sense in the sense of the European grid. Just one little anecdote: a couple of months ago, I noticed that some of my kitchen clocks uh, were off by a couple of minutes actually. And so I looked up on the internet, and turned out that something like a remote problem in the southeastern region of Europe, something like near the Balkans, I think, was setting off the grid frequency significantly, not by a huge amount, but consistently. So there was a shortfall in generation capacity there. And then some of the kitchen clocks actually, measure time by the grid frequency of 50 hertz. And this was interesting, that you could be affected by something that remote. Like, it's not even in a neighboring country; it's like two countries further down the line in the hierarchy of the grid.
Interesting.